in Iraq. There's a lot of stuff going on. They've chosen a new president, but it's not the one that Ambassador Bremer wanted. And so we now have this new man, Al-Yawar. Do you know anything about him?
I'm afraid to say I don't. Haven't met him, no.
45 years old. And also that they have the question about whether the Governing Council is going to continue. The Associated Press is saying that the Governing Council in Iraq has decided to dissolve immediately rather than go ahead. The White House is saying that that the Governing Council has voted, excuse me, that the Governing Council is going to go on and continue. Which is better?
Terrific way to start the day, especially for those of us who consider ourselves friends of Iraq and of the Kurds. It would be better, in my opinion, if it went on. And I don't know how the vote broke, and I don't know who voted for which side.
20 out of 22 members of the U.S. appointed body agreed to disband.
Well, I didn't want to second guess them. There are a number of them I know have felt for some time that they're a governing council only in name. That decisions are taken either in their absence or over their heads or even elsewhere. I mean, even not in Baghdad. And they're, in the meanwhile, of course, asked to run tremendous risks. I mean, a number of them have been shot. One of the women, fatally. So it's a hiding to nothing if you're asked to join. I mean, I imagine people, you know, they don't sit by the phone waiting to be rung and hoping it's going to be the call to the Governing Council.
The Washington Post says this morning that they now have 91 as the total number of military investigations going on in Iraq, more than what had been thought before.
Glad to hear it.
You're glad to hear it?
Yes.
That more investigations? Do you think that there are more instances than
well, I think it's. Let me put it like this. I mean, it's to the credit of the U.S. Armed Forces that, in fact, we know much of what we know about, for example, Abu Ghraib, which is a place where I've been. I was there about this time last year. A really horrific place, and with now everyone knows a double reputation for what one may as well call evil doing. I certainly don't think it should be called abuse, which is a silly word. We say child abuse as casually as we say alcohol abuse. Prisoner abuse is torture. We ought to say so. To finish my sentence, sorry, it's to the credit of the U.S. Armed Forces that we know most of what we know because of its own investigations.
You have.
And that these were begun some time ago, and it seemed to be fairly honestly conducted.
You have supported the president in Iraq?
Yes.
And is that wavering at all? Has it wavered at all in the last weeks?
Well, if you phrase it as supporting the president, that's a separate question from supporting regime change, I suppose. But I don't want to take any opportunity to seem as if I'm wavering. I mean, I notice some people are trying to straddle the gap. There is a difference between the president's policy and regime change, as a matter of fact. For example, I mean, the much despised and put upon and abused Ahmed Chalabi, among others, has been calling for some time, for many months, for an earlier transfer of sovereignty to Iraqis and for earlier elections. And I think appalling mistake was made, huge opportunity missed in not doing that earlier and giving the Iraqis the impression of an occupation. And that's what we're having to make up for now. Mr. Bremer, whose name keeps on coming up, I think did one very good thing, which was to replace the discredited Iraqi dinar with the picture of Saddam on it with something like a solid currency. Currency reform was the first thing he wanted to do. Actually got it done much more quickly than one might have expected. But if you like, that's the sort of guy he is. I don't want to take any of the credit for that away from him. It was an excellent thing to do, politically and economically, give them some real money. But there's a slight narrowness to that vision, if you see what I mean. It's not a matter of sort of fiscal and currency reform alone.
Speaking of Ambassador Bremer, the LA Times says today that they say that a member of the, is it Dawa? Is that how that's pronounced?
Yes.
The Dawa party, who was at the Sunday meetings when they were choosing this new president, said Bremer interfered and postponed the vote. They said that he came in and read them the Riot Act. How do you feel? Is the United States having the, in your opinion, right amount of pressure in terms of the choosing of the next leadership in Iraq?
Dawa, by the way, in Arabic means the call. It's the call the muezzin makes from the minaret is the dawa. In other words, that's an Islamic party making this criticism. I've heard people say who aren't Islamists on the council that Burma is very autocratic. One's been hearing that complaint for a long time.
We're going to open up our phone lines, invite you to join us. You'll see the phone numbers at the bottom of your screen. Christopher Hitchens will be with us for about 45 minutes. We're talking about any of the news of the day, but we might want to, before we take our first call, talk a little bit about your Slate piece that ran, I think, Sunday on Mr. Chalabi.
I think it was up by Sunday, yes.
Yes, it was on the web by Sunday.
Yeah.
What were you doing in terms of your support for Mr. Chalabi there?
Well, I thought someone should say a few words because he seems to be the scapegoat for a divided administration. In other words, there are many people within the administration who are practically at war with each other politically. I've never seen, I've been in Washington 22 years now, so much open bitterness between the State Department and the Defense Department and the CIA. These people are all pretty much strong enough to avoid destroying the other. It's a sort of mutual assured destruction, if you like, within the administration. But some of them seem to have decided that they could all agree to blame it all on someone else, namely Dr. Chalabi, and say, well, this is the guy who got us into all this. And I think that's unfair, but I also think it's untrue. It's absurd on its face. If you're reading the paper and you read that the only person who persuaded the United States administration that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and that Iraq was harboring terrorists and so forth was this sinister doctor with his sort of forgery kit, you have to just use a moment of reflection, I think, of common sense. It isn't possible that an intelligence system, service, for which we pay, what is it, 400 billion a year, can be just rolled and spun by an individual like that. And even if that's true, which, by the way, should mean a really big top-to-bottom inquest and clean out of the CIA, which I've been arguing for a long time anyway, wouldn't mind if the place was closed and padlocked for a bit and redone. How would it explain that Hans Blix believed that there were weapons in Iraq, that German intelligence believed there were weapons in Iraq, that French intelligence said there were weapons in Iraq, that Syria voted for the resolution that suggested there were weapons in Iraq? That cannot possibly all have been the work of the sinister Dr. Chalabi. He's a very brilliant man. I've known him for quite a while and extremely persuasive, but he couldn't have done all that. It stands to reason. Why did it all happen? Because of Iraq's track record. It's simply commonsensical. Up till then, every single time that the question had been investigated, Saddam Hussein was found to have been lying, concealing, blackmailing or murdering or intimidating his scientists, preventing them from talking, and endlessly seeking new ways of getting hold of WMD. In fact, I think that he was still trying that. If you look in the K report, there's one very interesting long section of it based entirely on Iraqi documents that shows that last March in Damascus, Saddam's people were meeting with Kim Jong-il's people secretly to try and buy the North Korean weapons system off the shelf and the production lines to make it. The meeting broke up because the North Koreans panicked because the coalition was moving into place around Iraq. But right up until March, they're still in the club that includes North Korea, Iran, Libya, and others who have a sort of private market in illegal weaponry. Now, that club has been quite badly broken up since the intervention in Iraq. So this is why I'm still on the side of the regime change forces. Libya has surrendered its arsenal. By walking back the origins of Libya's arsenal, we know a lot more about where all that stuff came from a private racketeering group in Pakistan, one of our former allies, and from North Korea. And we know that we've also caught, the UN inspectors have caught the Iranians cheating, and now there's an impasse. The Iranians have been found to be cheating on their nuclear development, and we don't know quite where that's going to go. But the situation is a lot more transparent than it was a year ago or so ago, and it's a lot more advantageous from our point of view. We know more about it. We've shut quite a lot of it down. In every case, they'd hugely underestimated how much the Iranians had, for example, gravely underestimated how much the Libyans had totally underestimated the threat of illegal dealing in Pakistan, and were more or less trusting the North Koreans. Now that's over. The right side to err on in receiving intelligence reports from Iran would be the side of having a nasty mind, a suspicious mind. Any other policy would have been quite irresponsible, I think.
Christopher Hitchens, First Call, Union, Oklahoma.
Good morning. Mr. Hitchens, number one, thank you so much for being one of the very few objective journalists left. Regardless of who's in the White House, you always shown an objectivity that plays well out here in Main Street America. And I wanted to get your take on the media's coverage of Abu Ghraib. I mean, Main Street America, I mean, I see people like Andrea Mitchell and Chris Matthews talking about how this is on the minds of the American people, but I don't see it. I think the only place that this even plays anymore, because you can't turn on the TV without seeing a all-star panel discussing this, I think the only place that it plays anymore is the golden ghettos of Manhattan and Hollywood. It doesn't play in Main Street America. We understand that it was wrong. We understand we're dealing with it. I've got one thing to say to the Katie Kirks and these folks of the world: get over it, okay? Get over it. We're not dumb. We know what happens. It's time to move on.
Mr. Hitchens.
Well, I mean, I don't know about Golden Ghetto, but I suppose I'm a within the Beltway elitist. I do try and get out there when I can. Actually, I find people are very interested. They're worried. And it's true some of them feel that it's gone on too long or it's been overplayed. But I think people also feel a sense of alarm. If they don't, they should. Of course, it's not as bad as Abu Ghraib used to be. I mean, I could tell you things about Abu Ghraib that would curl your hair.
Like what?
Well, I mean, not to talk about anything obscene or graphic then, but I mean, simply a few years ago that was decided by one of Saddam's sons that the prisons were overcrowded, which they were. So it was decided they would basically do a cull at random of the prisoners, but lists were drawn up. They used to execute up to a dozen people a day in Abu Ghraib. I've been to the execution pit. It's this terrible hole in the concrete with a bar, a beam, and several nooses on top. Can't imagine how horrible it was. I mean, actually, when I was there thinking, I'm glad this place is being cleaned out and repainted and taken over, but there's something horrible about it. Maybe it'd be better, you know, to start again. But I mean, unfortunately, we needed a prison in a hurry. Sorry, I'm giving you such a long answer, but anyway, the guards in the prison got the list of the people who were due to be culled and drove around their families, went to their homes in Baghdad and said, how much will you pay to keep your relatives off the list to be culled next week? That's the sort of thing that was going on, to say nothing of the kinds of torture and mutilation that actually you may have seen last week. The 7 Iraqi businessmen who'd had their right hands amputated in Abu Ghraib for dealing in dollars and had their foreheads branded as well. They've all been reconstituted now. They've got prosthetic arms. They've had the tattoos removed by volunteers in Texas, which I think you'll agree is middle America, mainstream America, what Europeans think of as cowboy America. The Texans took care of that for them, and I was very pleased to see there was that got recognized in the newspapers. But look, what happened in Abu Ghraib in the last few months, the last year, was paid for by our tax dollars. It's therefore our responsibility. We didn't pay for Saddam Hussein to amputate these people. That's not our responsibility in the same way. We shouldn't mention that in the same breath. We have to face what we have done or been responsible for and make sure it doesn't happen again. And I think very, very severely punish the traitors and cowards and giggling recreational sadists who thought it might be a laugh to not just do this, but to make cheap little videos of it for their amusement and for our discredit.
Little Rock, Arkansas.
It's very difficult, actually, you see, to say too much about this, to cover it too much.
Little Rock, Arkansas. Good morning.
Yes, thanks, Connie. What a pleasure it is to finally get through to C-SPAN.
Welcome.
I'm a junkie. I just have a question and a couple of quick observations, if I may. Mr. Hitchens, what makes you believe, sir, that we should have supported this Ahmad Jalabi, knowing that he's a convicted felon, wanted in Jordan for bank fraud and embezzlement, number one. Number two, Bush has shown his contempt for democracy by snubbing his nose at the world through the United Nations. And he has also shown contempt for my Christian faith. You know, the golden rule is do unto others as you would have others do unto you. Preemptive strike is just the opposite of that. Preemptive strike is based on fear. It's do unto others before they do it to you, based on fear. That is just the opposite of the golden rule. That is anti-Christian Christian. That was a command of Christ, not a suggestion.
Thanks, Little Rock.
I have tried to find out what occurred with Dr. Chalabi and the Petra Bank in Jordan, the Bank of Petra. And I can safely say that I don't know, because it's an extremely murky business. In other words, I don't know that it isn't true, and nor do I know that it is, and neither, by the way, do you, or do any of the other people who say they know that he was guilty. Wanted in Jordan, you could say, or convicted, it was a military tribunal that did this investigation and handed down that verdict. Military tribunals don't normally do bank fraud cases. The counter-suggestion made by Dr. Chalabi, who says he can prove it and says he has documents that will, I don't trust him necessarily to be right on this, but it deserves to be said that his case hasn't yet been presented, is that was the revenge through the Jordanian apparatus, which was quite close at that point to Saddam Hussein, for his anti-Saddam activities in Jordan. Again, I won't say I know that's true either, but it's the side of it that's least often mentioned. If you're interested in fraud and misappropriation, I hope you've been following the UN oil for food scandal and the unbelievable criminality and waste and misallocation that appears to be involved there. I mention this not as a matter of moral equivalence, but because you mentioned the United Nations as if it was something that had a sort of sacred or constitutional power. In the case of Iraq, it had failed repeatedly to enforce even its own resolutions, and not only that, but was acting in direct collusion, possibly for corrupt motives, through its bureaucracy with the Iraqi regime. I think that state of affairs has been allowed to go on far too long. I'm not a Christian or a believer in any other faith, so I don't want to adjudicate between you and the Nazarene and President Bush, but I think probably Bush could use being told more often that he isn't a Christian, because he too often claims that he is. My view about preemption is that if you don't favor it, and perhaps you don't, then people should stop attacking the administration for failing to foresee 9/11, because there's only one way that I know of that could have been prevented, and that would have been the bombing of the al-Qaeda camps, at least the bombing, and perhaps the dropping in by parachute of a force to take out the al-Qaeda camps in Afghanistan, and that would have been getting your retaliation in first. But there's no other way that what we saw could have been stopped, and it's possible not even that would have worked.
Los Angeles, good morning.
Yes, good morning. I find some of your comments quite interesting, Mr. Hitchens. I really do, because any of us who have followed the Middle East for any length of time, and I've been involved in the peace movement in Israel-Palestine for the past 40 years, clearly understand that there are two occupations going right now in the Middle East, one in Iraq and one in Palestine, and the American public funds both of those occupations. So just one quick comment about your WMD. The reason that most of the people in the area wanted weapons of mass destruction is because Israel has them. Israel has more than any of them. So when you look at the abuse in places like Abu Ghraib and some of the other places, and Chalabi, they have all been underwritten by the neocons in Washington. And I'm kind of interested what you think about this John B. Israel, who many of us who follow through the Internet recognize as an Iraqi national who is Jewish and was probably under the control of either Mossad and or Shin Bet. I think a lot of the torture that happened in Abu Ghraib was a direct teaching from the torture that the Israelis have done to the Palestinians. Yet the Vanity Fair, the LA Times, you never cover that. I'm curious as to whether you are going to cover that.
On your first point that there are only two occupations in the Middle East, I would say that, myself would say that the occupation by Syria of Lebanon would count, and some would say that the occupation by Turkey of Kurdistan would count too. But you'd be wrong, though you're right in saying that Israel did introduce weapons of mass destruction to the Middle East, and I've written a couple of articles, more than a couple actually, about Mordecai Vanunu, the Israeli whistleblower who revealed the fact that actually, in fact, we already knew, but made it a certainty and in some detail, and also showed how Israel had cheated and broken all the rules to acquire that weaponry. Then you say, so I'm fine so far, you might think, but when you say that's why other people in the Middle East want the weapons of mass destruction because Israel has them, I just think you're flat out mistaken. If Saddam Hussein had had a nuclear weapon, he would have used it on Iran, on another Muslim country. The use of the chemical weapons that he did have was always on Persians and Kurds, Shia and Sunni Muslims. It's naive to think that he would have tried to do anything about Israel. After all, Israel could have, so to speak, defended itself. The other thing you might bear in mind, since you care about the Palestinians, is that if Saddam Hussein had used those weapons in Israel or in the Holy Land, wherever we agree to call it, he would have been killing Palestinians as well as Israelis. There isn't a weapon of that kind you can use that discriminates between Jews and Arabs. Now, the second point. Oh, yes, the neocon cabal. Well, I don't know anything about John B. Israel, I should specify, but I suppose I get up to 100 emails a day telling me that there's a Jewish neoconservative cabal in Washington. I'm getting bored with hearing this as an explanation, and I have to say, not in your case, ma'am. I'm also getting slightly irritated by the tone of voice that underlies some of that. I'm sure you can guess what I mean. And though it's not at all unlikely that Mossad would be helping with the interrogation process, I don't think that what we saw in those videos is borrowed from Mossad. Well, I'll tell you just one reason why. Something that not everyone always points out. With those torture and humiliation videos, no claim has been made even that that was being done to extract important information from dangerous people. Everybody knows that there's a real moral and theoretical problem about having in your custody someone who is a member of something like Al-Qaeda and may have information that's time-related. And everybody knows that there are permissible pressures that can be brought and impermissible ones that mustn't be brought. And the Israelis have been trying to walk that line, disciplined very strongly, by the way, by their own Supreme Court, which ruled against physical torture. The Mossad would, I think, have the same contempt anyone would have for these antics, these sordid, sadistic antics of the kind that we've been seeing. So, in case any of that helps you to discriminate a bit, I offer it.
For Christopher Hitchens, next call, Vancouver, Washington.
Yes, I'm a first-time caller. Mr. Hitchens, I can't believe that you don't know that and believe in your own heart that this was not necessary, this war. The thing of it is that they knew that we had flyovers there. They didn't have any anti-aircraft guns to shoot us down. They had no Air Force. They had no Navy. And Bush had that figured out ahead of time. We'd walk in there. And I just think that it was misleading the public to ever do that. And with his private army of privatization, we have people there that are privatized doing the torturing, getting billions of dollars from the people here, from the citizens, for war profiteering. It was not necessary.
Thank you, Vancouver.
Well, God, it must be early in Vancouver.
Yeah.
It would take a very long time for me to tell you all the reasons why I think that the confrontation with Saddam Hussein was inevitable as well as desirable, in other words, in the sense of being necessary. But actually you touch on one of them. We had, in fact, never stopped being at war with his regime since the invasion of Kuwait. There was basically only a long armed truce, in the course of which, between 91, 92 and 2003, sanctions were imposed, quite punitive ones, which the CIA, with its usual brilliance, thought would bring down the Saddam Hussein regime within a year, which gravely distorted and punished the Iraqi economy and society, made us co-responsible with Saddam Hussein actually for running Iraq, meant that we had, in fact, inherited Iraq as a real responsibility. Now, I don't see how that responsibility could have been discharged without saying, well, first off, we're going to stop co-operating, co-running the place with Saddam Hussein. He goes. We start again without him. I wish myself that had been done in 91. I think we'd be living in a much better world if it had been. I think the neoconservatives were right on that point. They would have got blamed for it then too, but they would have been dead right. The intervening 10 years saw this terrible damage to Iraqi society, the production of this half-starved, half-educated underclass that we're seeing now, which Iraq didn't used to have. And second, it gave 10 years for Saddam Hussein to Islamicize his regime, to stop pretending to be a secularist and come right out with it and say he was for holy war. Put the words Allahu Akbar, God is great, on the Iraqi flag. Start pumping money to fundamentalist and Islamic fascist groups within and outside Iraq, the people we're now fighting now. The confrontation with them was unpostponable too, but if you just let it run, it would have gone through the Saddam Hussein regime, which was in a terminal phase, through the delightful period of rule by his two sons, who I think might even have quarreled and ruled successively rather than together, but that would have been a gorgeous thing to see. And then would have been taken over by people like Muqtada Sadr and Mr. Zarqawi. And then a really major state and really important country and a very important society would have been lost worse than Somalia or Rwanda. And we'd now be having an inquest into how on earth we let that happen. I think it was done too late, and you're right in saying it was done with too much upbeat suggestion that it would be easy, but that it was necessary and that it was inevitable, I do not doubt, and neither should you.
The flag on your lapel?
Is the flag of Kurdistan. Which I think one would have to say was one of the unarguable successes of the regime change policy. I mean, the northern provinces of Iraq, sometimes called Kurdistan, where about a 20th of the population live. I think there are about 300 American soldiers there, and they don't even have to wear helmets. There are 4 female high court judges, 20 newspapers, a huge amount of reconstruction and rebuilding going on. It's real liberated territory, and this is the most important and, well, the largest minority in the Middle East. In fact, the largest people in the world who don't have a state of their own. But they, of course, have been free of Saddam Hussein's control since '91. Shows what can be done with regime change if you do it in time.
Lawrenceville, Georgia. Good morning.
Well, good morning. It's a pleasure to talk to Mr. Hitchens. I've been watching you, following your career for a number of years, and I'm always interested in what you have to say.
Thank you.
I was very amused by something you said the other day about how Europeans see Mr. Moore, Michael Moore. I had to say I got a really good chuckle out of that one. But okay, congratulations, by the way, on becoming a citizen shortly. I heard.
Yes, it's the paperwork is beginning, as it were. Yeah.
Good, good. Well, I think Connie should be somewhat chastised for not asking the most important question. And since Brian Lamb's not there, I figured I would call and ask it. Are you still a socialist?
You may not know this, Connie. There's a backstory here. I've been doing this show since 1982.
Right. Oh,
And I remember the look of sheer horror. Well, no, that's not true, because he never would betray such a thing. But a mild shock that crept over Brian's inscrutable features when I told him of my socialist convictions. And every time I came back, he would keep on asking me, "Are you still?" And I think I probably went on saying yes, fractionally longer than I should have done.
Really?
Just not to give him the satisfaction, frankly. I didn't want any celebrations on the right, Hitchens has seen the light or that kind of thing. But the truth of the matter is that it and all other party attachments have fallen away from me, died in me somehow over the last few years. I don't identify with any ideology now or any faction anymore. So to that extent, I can't say that I am, no. But I don't think I wasted the time that I was. I mean, a socialist, that's to say. I mean, there are a lot of things that I did when I was on the left, or said or believed, that I would certainly repeat and only wish I'd done more about.
You want to share with us what you shared about Michael Moore?
It's awful that, sometimes you do your best, you try and make a serious point, you do an analysis of, as it might be, regime change in Kurdistan, but what people really like is when you go ad hominem. And I regret to say I gave into this impulse the other day and more or less said that that Europeans think of Americans as fat, lazy, provincial, greedy, oafish, vulgar, and complacent and so on. And it's how odd it is that Europe's favorite American seems to be someone who has all those characteristics.
Next is
Terrible thing to say, really, but someone had to say it.
Farmingdale, Long Island.
Yes, Mr. Hitchens. First of all, Iraq and Iran during World War II, they were impressed with the Americans. They wanted to break the chains of colonialism and imperialism, Qasem in Iraq and Mossadegh in Iran, they looked up to America as a land who kicked the British and the French out of their country, and they poured their oil profits into developing a secular socialist states that produce more PhDs than we have in this country per capita. And they reduced religious authority by forcing religious schools, all peoples of all faiths, to go together in the same schools. I mean, both countries developed doctors of both sexes. What happened was the United States overthrew Mossadegh with the Shah and got the Ayatollah. We overthrew Qasem during the Nixon-Bush administration. Then we got Saddam Hussein in power. The CIA put him in power when Qasem wanted to take over Kuwait back, I think it was in '61, tried to get rid of the oak of sheikdoms that the British imperialists and French and Turks and everybody else had tried to create, and we just stirred the fires of fanatical religious faiths, not only in Afghanistan but in Yugoslavia. It's all a game. It's a chess game for the oil companies and these Bilderbergers or whatever they call them, that maybe you have become part of. I know Clinton is, and I know the rest of you are. It's a disgrace to the human race what we're doing to these people. We destroyed the core. I would like you to answer this question. I'd like to answer you back, sir.
Fine. Well, it's I always find it depressing when I'm confronted with something that's half true, such as what you began by saying. I mean, it is, as far as I know, actually I wrote a book about it, just been reprinted as a matter of fact, just recently it's called Blood, Class and Empire, about the inheritance by the United States, especially of the British colonial institutions and practices and alliances. And I describe in there what happened in Iran in particular in the 1950s, and generally speaking anyway, until you started going on about Bilderbergers and conspiracy groups and the rest of it, you were quite lucid, sir, and I was with you. You're wrong about the oil companies inflaming religious hatred in Yugoslavia. I don't think that's true at all. But you were doing splendidly. And indeed, it's a critique that many of us have made of American policy in the region, that it has relied on proxy powers, local dictatorships or military elites. The hope of the removal of the Saddam Hussein regime was that it marked a break with that. As indeed it does. A very risky break, but I think a very necessary one. And the fact of the matter is that in Iran now, the most popular symbol is the Stars and Stripes. Young people sew it onto their jackets. They think of the United States as a secular and plural country of the sort they'd like to live in instead of the depraved theocracy they do have to live under.
Let's give you a quick
So there are some
follow-up.
ironies, in other words, in the American policy.
I like to say that we're the ones. It was Theodore Roosevelt's son that went over there
Yes.
and overthrew the Mossadegh regime. We had a chance to have very good friends over there, and they would have given us good over. They nationalized their oil industry. Why the heck did the British landlock Iraq when they created Kuwait? It's just a sheikdom. We support these sheikdoms.
Okay, caller.
Like Saudi Arabia. I mean,
Thanks.
it's despicable what we've done to the world, and we're threatening it with these nuclear bombs.
Thanks.
Bush wants to-
Thank you, Farmingdale. Appreciate your call.
He's right about Kermit Roosevelt, as a matter of fact. That is true. He's not quite right about Kuwait. I mean, the British did draw, Sir Percy Cox was his name. He did draw the border between Iraq and Kuwait. It doesn't completely landlock Iraq. Iraq does have a coastline there. And by the way, Kuwait has existed as an entity since before the British got there. There is such a place as Kuwait. It's not just not just a sheikhdom. But it's amazing when you look at it. If you look at the general world horizon of foreign policy today, you think the partition, the border in Pakistan and India, Kashmir, Cyprus, Palestine, Ireland, the border of Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, all of these drawn in the 20th century by British civil servants trying to wind down the empire and get the hell out of there. There's even a book about it called Divide and Quit. Huge amount of American policy is based on cleaning up after the British Empire. The gentleman's essentially right about that.
Chicago, good morning.
Good morning.
Excuse me.
Hello.
You're on the air.
Yes.
curious as to whether you know about a book written by Catherine Cook. It is called Stolen Youth, The Politics of Israel's Detention of Palestinian Children. Now, I was born there, and I'm part of Women in Black, which is a Israeli women's peace group. I have been there many, many, many times. And for you to so cavalierly say that the Israelis do not practice torture is just not correct at all. They not only do the torture, but they are busy torturing at the moment 2,000 young children between the ages of 13 and 17. So I think that when you say things such as Israel's not involved in the torture of the Iraqis or in teaching them, it is not correct, because that's where the hoods came from. It's where the tie-downs came from. Any of us who have been there for many, many years working with the Palestinians, we know that.
Thank you, Chicago. Let's let Mr. Hitchens respond.
Shalom. I think you misunderstood my last reply, by the way. I did not say there was no torture in the occupied territories or torture practiced by Israel, and I said I was pretty sure that there would have been Mossad advice to the American operatives in Iraq. What I was trying to say was this: the Israeli Supreme Court has found cases of and heard, because of the suits brought among other things by Bet Salem, the Israeli human rights organization I'm sure you're familiar with, adjudicated on many cases of torture and has said there are some things you may not do. There's certain kinds of physical force that can't be employed. Now, this is a horrible business, because once you start trying to codify it at all, you're probably already tainted with it. But everybody knows that there is a what I describe as a moral and theoretical problem about what to do about non-state combatants whose tactics involve the infliction of civilian casualties, but whose aims are the infliction of civilian casualties. That's not just what they do, it's what they want. They want to end up with a system where a human life is meaningless. This is a problem, and one can't just emote about it. I think because in the end the jihad forces are going to be defeated, because in fact all jihads always lose, partly because of their own irrationality, partly because what they demand is impossible, partly because they start squabbling among themselves. We're going to be doing this for a very long time. I believe we should be extremely patient and extremely careful about it and deny ourselves any form of extremism in the exercise of reprisal or interrogation. We can afford to be patient. That's my view. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't be ruthless.
Cranston.
I also, excuse me, wanted
Sure.
to add something.
Mm-hmm.
When the first caller, who's being echoed by this one,
Right.
said about the two occupations and the relationship between them, the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and to some lesser extent of Gaza is based on the preposterous idea that there is a biblical warrant for Jewish Israeli domination of these areas. That it's given them by God, in other words. I've always believed that the Supreme Court should rule that no American aid can go to this, because it would be violation of the Establishment of Religion Clause of the First Amendment, if for no other reason. However, the United States is not in Iraq on that basis and doesn't say we're here because God wants us to be and he's given us Iraq and all its people and all its resources. So to that extent, the comparison, I think falls, does it not?
Cranston, Rhode Island.
Good morning. Mr. Hitchens, I have to disagree with you, sir. The whole Europe, majority of the Europe, let's put it this way, thinks that Israel is posing a threat to world peace. What are you saying about the Europeans, about the American people, that they think that we are this fan and arrogant and all this stuff? I have to disagree with that with you, sir, because I think the Europeans, they look us Americans as one-sided, that we are helping out Israel, and it's all right to help out Israel. Israel is a great nation, and what it's doing to itself now, it will pay later. What they should do is they should move back to 1967 border as the first step and give to the Palestinians what they belongs to Palestinians, the Jewish people. I'm sure they want peace, and they're nice and smart people, and I don't know why they're killing each other. And then it will be a fresh step towards peace, because Iraq.
Well, I have some claim to be European myself, so I think I may at least illustrate to you the point that there's no such thing as a general European opinion, and I probably shouldn't have suggested that it was in my cheap shot at Mr. Moore either. Well, you can have my opinion for free. There are two peoples living in Palestine, and the obvious solution for a long time, since before '67, seems to be is they each have a state. That's even implied in the Balfour Declaration. That's the founding document, if you will, morally at any rate, of the State of Israel. If there's to be a Jewish homeland there, it must be without prejudice to the rights of the existing inhabitants. It's as simple as that. If it wasn't for religion, it could be done too, but unfortunately the extreme Zionists, though they're having some second thoughts now, even in the Likud party, about the idea of Eretz Israel, of the greater Israel mandated by the Old Testament. But they still maintain anyway that there's nothing you can do, it's beyond human control, this was given by God. It doesn't take much to get Muslim extremists to echo that and say, well, no, this land actually is all Muslim and should go back to the Caliphate. And then in the United States, there are a large number of Christian Zionists who hope that this tussle can help to bring on Armageddon and the, is it the second or the first, I can never remember, coming of Jesus Christ. These kinds of irrational cultist movements, sometimes called monotheistic religion, make what is an obvious solution impossible. But the majority of Jewish American voters have, whenever polled, registered support for a two-state solution, and a majority of Israeli Jewish voters can still be found for that proposition. So there's still some hope that that reason can prevail over the faithful.
Melbourne, Florida.
Hi, good morning, C-SPAN.
Morning.
I got two statements I got off the U.S. House of Representatives, and one quick question. The first statement is that when you recall, the President and others made repeated references to the unmanned aerial vehicles that they told us were a threat to the United States, that Iraq could fly over America and spray biochem weapons. I mean, I don't want to...
Yeah, I do remember.
Okay, but the President told us that our intel services were telling us that was going on. Well, let me tell you that what the United States Air Force was telling the President, quote, the Air Force does not agree that Iraq is developing UAVs with the primary intention of delivering biochem weapons. The United States Air Force stated that the small size of Iraq's UAV strongly suggests a primary role of reconnaissance. And my other statement is the speech made to the UN by Colin Powell. To sum it up, the story goes, Colin Powell, this is from the U.S. House of Representatives, by the way. Okay, Colin Powell made a speech, had the CIA analyze it and discuss it with him. They even drafted the speech, which then went to the White House. But when it emerged, it looked totally different. And the story goes that the Vice President and his Chief of Staff and National Security Advisor and National Security staff were involved in this.
Caller, when you say it came from the House of Representatives, what do you mean? I mean, what are you reading from?
It was Representative William Delahunt, which is an excellent speaker. I always see him up there with...
Okay. So
and my quick question,
okay,
please.
Go ahead.
I'm wondering, from maybe an intel perspective, if you go overseas and look at the terrorist attacks, it's always like a bomb. But every single terrorist attack, it's going to happen here. It's going to be some spectacular, huge event. Like, why is that? What's going on there?
You mean the difference in the size?
Yeah, it's going to be some... Thank you.
Mr. Hitchens.
Well, taking it in order, I mean, what he says is, I'm not sure about the reworking of the Colin Powell, George Tenet presentation by the White House. I don't know that I know that, but I know that that it's true that Secretary Powell and George Tenet were closeted for a long time, and George Tenet sat behind Secretary of State Powell during making of the speech to sort of indicate that they were right behind him. The agency was right behind him on all this. It takes us back to the very first question you asked me, or the second question actually, about Dr. Chalabi. Secretary Powell has always disliked intensely Dr. Chalabi, and George Tenet has been trying for a very long time to sabotage and undermine him and discredit him. The CIA has hated Dr. Chalabi for about a decade. The guy's two worst enemies in the administration, backed by a $400 billion intelligence apparatus, make a presentation at the UN, which is found to be full of holes, and it's all blamed on Chalabi. People really must start to get real about this. I didn't really understand the second half of the question, and I don't think I'm wholly at fault, because I don't think you did either.
No, I didn't.
I don't know. I mean, I think what he was asking about was, why is it, as it were, things that go off statically rather than are conveyed by some other form of delivery system?
Or huge monumental explosions versus small car bombs.
I know people who spend all of their time worrying about what can be smuggled into the United States by ship, either through the seaways or the harbors, how difficult it is to patrol the high seas, how easy it might be to get a weapon of mass terror on board one of those. I don't know, but I think we'd be speculating, and I would start to babble.
Will your citizenship papers come through in time for the election?
Probably not. Homeland Security seems to have taken over the INS now. I mean, there's a tremendous paperwork backlog. People are getting lost in it, but I don't think I'll be able to vote, no, if that's what you meant.
So are you going to speculate on who you would vote for if you could?
Well, if it was,
you've talked about that.
Sure, no, if it was, I'm a single issue voter, as I guess must have become apparent. And I'm not a Republican, I'm not a conservative, I'm not a very great admirer of the president in many ways, but I think that my condition is that there be an administration that wakes up every morning wondering how to make life hard for the forces of jihad, and how to make as far as possible an unapologetic defense of civilization against this kind of barbarism. And though the Bush administration has been rife with disappointment on this and incompetence, I nonetheless feel they have, in some sense, that spirit. I don't get that feeling from anyone who even sought the Democratic nomination, I have to say.
So if it were today, you would vote for President Bush, and you could?
I think I'd have to vote for the re-election of the president, yeah. Yes, I think I would.
Christopher Hitchens, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thanks for asking.
Appreciate it. We're going to be talking more about energy and oil. We have about 30 minutes. We have the Deputy Energy Secretary with us. We'll be right back.
President Bush heads to Europe this week. He meets with the leaders of Italy and France, as well as the Pope. Mr. Bush also takes part in ceremonies marking the 60th anniversary of D-Day. We'll get a preview of the trip this morning